I never should have requested this posting. The recruiter said it would be peaceful, a quiet deployment on a remote island where the biggest challenge would be the boredom. I remember laughing when he said that. Now, as I sit in my barracks writing this, I wish boredom was my only problem. The journey to the Falkland Islands was long and uncomfortable. The military transport plane rattled through turbulent skies, the gray ocean endless beneath us. I spent most of the flight trying to sleep, but the constant vibration made it impossible. Private Jacob Nolan, reporting for duty at the edge of the world. We landed on a Friday evening in March, the sun already setting despite it being only 6 p.m. The wind howled across the runway, carrying a bite that cut straight through my jacket. Mount Pleasant Military Base sprawled before me, a collection of aging buildings that seemed to huddle together against the desolate landscape. Rust stains streaked down the walls like tears, and something about the place felt wrong from the moment my boots hit the tarmac. Sergeant Lewis Harper met me at the entrance. He was a tall man with deep-set eyes and weathered skin that spoke of years spent in this harsh environment. His handshake was firm, but his fingers were ice-cold. "Welcome to Mount Pleasant," he said, his voice gruff. "Keep your head down, follow orders, and you'll do fine here." There was something in his tone that made it sound more like a warning than a greeting. The base should have housed over 200 personnel, but as Harper led me through the corridors, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was strangely empty. Our footsteps echoed off the metal walls, and most of the rooms we passed were dark. When I asked about it, Harper just shrugged. "Night shift," he said, but it didn't explain the layer of dust I noticed on some of the doorknobs. My orientation briefing was held in a small room that smelled of mold and old coffee. As Harper went through the standard protocols, I noticed the radio on his desk kept picking up strange bursts of static. Each time it happened, he would pause for just a moment, his jaw tightening before he continued. I tried to focus on the briefing, but the static seemed to form patterns, almost like whispers just below the threshold of understanding. The barracks were in the eastern wing of the base, and my assigned room was at the end of a long hallway. "Get some rest," Harper said as he left me at the door. "Tomorrow you'll meet Captain Moore for your assignment." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "If you hear anything unusual during the night, don't get up to investigate. Just stay in your room until morning." I wanted to ask what he meant, but he was already walking away, his footsteps fading into the constant hum of the base's ventilation system. My room was small but functional, a bed, a desk, and a small window that looked out over the barren landscape. The glass was thick and slightly warped, making the view outside seem distorted and strange. As I unpacked my few belongings, I noticed something odd about the room. Despite the heating system being on, there was a persistent cold spot near the corner. When I walked through it, the temperature drop was so sudden it made me gasp. I tried to rationalize it. Old buildings often have draft problems, but something about it felt deliberate, like stepping through an invisible curtain. That first night, I learned why Harper had warned me about unusual sounds. The tapping started around midnight, a gentle, irregular pattern that seemed to come from inside the walls. At first, I thought it might be pipes expanding or contracting, but it didn't sound like metal. It was softer, more organic, like fingertips drumming on hollow wood. I tried to ignore it, but the tapping gradually moved, traveling around the room as if something was circling me. The cold spot in the corner seemed to expand, and the air grew heavy with an inexplicable presence. When I finally fell asleep, my dreams were filled with dark figures standing in thick fog, their forms just barely visible but unmistakably watching. I woke with a start at 3 a.m., the room pitch black except for the faint glow from my digital clock. The tapping had stopped, but something else had replaced it, a low, continuous hum that seemed to vibrate in my bones. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed my boots, which I'd left by the door, were now filled with what looked like black sand. I hadn't been anywhere near sand since arriving. The next morning, I tried to ask the other soldiers about the strange occurrences. Most of them avoided eye contact and changed the subject. Only one person, Corporal Annie Reynolds, showed any sympathy. She was a petite woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. But when I mentioned the tapping sounds, her professional demeanor cracked slightly. "You're in room 237, right?" she asked, her voice low despite the empty mess hall around us. When I nodded, she pushed her breakfast tray aside and leaned forward. "That room has a history. 3 other soldiers requested transfers after staying there. The last one," she glanced around before continuing, "the last one had to be sedated after he claimed something was trying to communicate with him through the walls." I tried to laugh it off, but the sound caught in my throat. Through the mess hall windows, I could see fog rolling in from the sea, thick and unnatural in its movement. It seemed to curl around the buildings like fingers, probing for a way in. Corporal Reynolds followed my gaze and frowned. "The fog here isn't normal," she said quietly. "Nothing here is. If you're smart, you'll request a transfer before." She stopped abruptly as Captain Moore entered the mess hall. He was a tall, imposing figure with perfectly pressed uniform and an unnaturally calm demeanor. As he passed our table, the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. That's when I knew I had to start documenting everything. Something is wrong on this base, something that goes beyond typical military secrets. I've found old newspaper clippings in the recreation room about missing patrol units from the 1980s. The articles stop abruptly, as if someone decided these disappearances shouldn't be reported anymore. The maintenance worker, an elderly man named Frank who's been here since before the Falklands War, let something slip yesterday about the old days before they woke it up. When I pressed him for details, he practically ran away from me, making a sign against evil I didn't recognize. This morning, I found strange markings carved into my bathroom mirror, curves and lines that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. When I reported it to Lieutenant Emily Clark during my mandatory medical checkup, she became visibly pale. She wrote something in my file with shaking hands and prescribed sleeping pills I know I won't take. Something tells me I need to stay alert here, especially at night. The base feels alive in a way that has nothing to do with the soldiers stationed here. There's a pulse to this place, a rhythm that beats beneath the concrete and steel. And sometimes, in the depths of night, when the fog presses against my window like a living thing, I swear I can hear it calling my name. The night shift changed everything. After a week on the base, Sergeant Harper assigned me to monitor the communications room from midnight to 8 a.m. "It's an easy job," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Just log any incoming transmissions and maintain radio contact with our patrol units." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "And whatever you hear on the frequencies, don't respond unless you can verify the source." The communications room was a windowless space filled with aging equipment. Banks of radio receivers lined the walls, their displays casting a sickly green glow over everything. The chair creaked as I settled in for my first shift, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet room. For the first few hours, everything was normal. I logged the routine check-ins from the patrol units and monitored the emergency frequencies. But at exactly 2:47 a.m., something changed. The static on one of the receivers shifted, becoming rhythmic, almost musical. At first, I thought it was interference from a civilian broadcast. But as I listened closer, I realized the sounds weren't random. Buried beneath the static was a voice, or voices. They spoke in overlapping whispers, some in English, others in languages I didn't recognize. I fumbled for my phone, trying to record it, but the device was dead despite being fully charged minutes earlier. The voices grew clearer, and I could make out fragments of what they were saying. "Beneath the ice. They don't know what they found. Should have left it sleeping." My hands shook as I noted the frequency in the logbook. As I wrote, I noticed similar entries from previous nights, each marked with a single word: unverified. The entries went back months, all occurring between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., all on slightly different frequencies. The next morning, I showed the log to Corporal Reynolds. She led me to a secluded corner of the mess hall, her face tense. "There's something called Project Deepwell," she whispered. "I've seen the name in old files. Back in '82, during the war, they found something when they were expanding the base, something they shouldn't have disturbed." Before she could elaborate, Lieutenant Clark appeared with several armed guards. "Corporal Reynolds," she said, her voice cold. "You're needed in medical for an overdue evaluation." Reynolds shot me a warning look as they led her away. I didn't see her again for 3 days. When she returned, something was different. She smiled too much, her movements mechanical. When I tried to ask about Project Deepwell, she stared through me as if I wasn't there. Later that day, I overheard her reporting my questions to Captain Moore. I knew I had to be more careful, but I couldn't stop digging. The base's layout made no sense. Corridors that should have connected led to dead ends, and doors marked on the blueprints didn't exist. During my night shifts, I started mapping the discrepancies. A pattern emerged, suggesting a whole section of the base had been deliberately hidden. The old warehouse seemed like the best place to start looking for answers. It was a massive structure on the edge of the base, supposedly used for storage but always padlocked. I spent days watching it, noting that despite being abandoned, people entered at odd hours, always in groups of 3, always wearing environmental protection suits. I got my chance to investigate when the power grid needed maintenance. In the confusion of the scheduled blackout, I slipped away from my post. The warehouse door was protected by a keypad, but I'd memorized the code watching the suited groups enter. 1982, the year everything changed. The interior was vast and dimly lit by emergency lights. Rows of shelves stretched into the darkness, holding crates marked with warnings in multiple languages. The air was thick with a metallic smell that made my throat burn. As I moved deeper into the warehouse, my flashlight beam revealed what looked like scientific equipment, covered in dust but obviously well maintained. In a back office, I found a journal from 1982. The writer, a scientist named Dr. Harrison, described the discovery of an anomalous energy signature during the base's expansion. They dug too deep, broke through into something ancient. The last entry was a frantic scrawl. "It's not speaking to us, it's speaking through us." Movement in the darkness made me freeze. Footsteps approached, accompanied by a strange scraping sound. I killed my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall. Through the office window, I saw 3 figures in protective suits moving through the warehouse. They were dragging something that left wet marks on the concrete floor. I held my breath as they passed, but something made them stop. One turned toward the office, and through the suit's faceplate, I saw only darkness where a face should have been. The figure tilted its head, moving in a way that human joints shouldn't allow. I knew with absolute certainty that what I was seeing wasn't a person in a suit. It was something else wearing a human shape. The emergency lights flickered, and in that momentary darkness, the figures vanished. I waited 5 minutes before moving, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would give me away. As I crept toward the exit, I noticed the wet marks on the floor had changed. They were moving, flowing together like mercury, forming patterns that hurt my eyes to look at. I ran. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I ran until I reached my room, locked the door, and wedged a chair under the handle. That's when I noticed the smell. That same metallic odor from the warehouse was now coming from my vents. As I write this, I can hear something moving in the ventilation system, getting closer. The base's secret is bigger than missing soldiers or classified experiments. This place, this island, holds something ancient and hungry, and now that I've seen behind the curtain, I don't think it's going to let me go. The whispers and the static are getting louder, and when I close my eyes, I see that empty suit turning toward me over and over again. Captain Moore has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. Mandatory attendance for all personnel. I don't think it's a coincidence that this comes right after my warehouse investigation. If I don't make it, if something happens to me, let this stand as my testimony. There's a presence in Mount Pleasant Military Base, something that's been here long before us, and it's finally ready to show itself. The emergency meeting never happened. Instead, the base plunged into chaos at 3 a.m. when the power grid failed completely. Emergency lights bathed the corridors in blood-red illumination as the backup generators kicked in. Through my window, I watched the fog roll in thicker than ever before, bringing with it an unnatural silence that muffled even the howling wind. I was preparing for my night shift when the alarms began. Not the usual warning sirens, but a deep, resonating tone that seemed to vibrate through the building's foundations. Over the PA system, Captain Moore's voice remained eerily calm. All personnel report to emergency stations. This is not a drill. Repeat, all personnel report to emergency stations. In the corridor, I ran into Private Thompson from B Company. His face was pale, eyes wide with panic. "They found something in the lower levels," he gasped. "The maintenance crew was doing repairs and broke through a wall. There's some kind of chamber down there." Before he could finish, the lights flickered, and in that moment of darkness, Thompson vanished. Just vanished. The only trace was a damp footprint where he'd been standing. The lower levels were officially off limits, but I knew I had to see for myself. The service stairwell was unguarded. Everyone was too busy with the emergency protocols. As I descended past the ground floor, the air grew thick and humid. The temperature rose with each step, despite the infamous Falklands cold above. 5 levels down, I found the breach. A massive hole gaped in the concrete wall, revealing a tunnel that couldn't have been made by human hands. The walls were smooth, almost glassy, and seemed to pulse with a faint bioluminescence. The air coming from the opening carried that same metallic smell from the warehouse, but stronger now, almost overwhelming. I heard voices echoing from deeper in the tunnel, Sergeant Harper and Lieutenant Clark arguing in harsh whispers. Pressing myself against the wall, I inched closer to listen. "It's breaking free," Clark was saying, her professional demeanor cracking. "The containment field is failing. We have to initiate Protocol 0. If we do that, everyone on this base dies," Harper growled. "There has to be another way. You've seen the readings. You know what happened in 82. If we don't contain it now, we won't just lose the base. We'll lose everything." Their voices faded as they moved deeper into the tunnel. I should have retreated, should have run back to the surface and requested an immediate transfer. Instead, I pulled out my flashlight and stepped through the breach. The tunnel descended at a steep angle, curving in ways that defied normal architecture. The bioluminescent pulses grew stronger, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. The air became thicker, almost liquid in my lungs. After what felt like hours but couldn't have been more than 20 minutes, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. My flashlight beam couldn't reach the ceiling, but the walls glowed with the same organic light, revealing something that shouldn't exist. In the center of the chamber stood a structure that looked like a cross between an altar and a machine. Ancient stone merged with modern military equipment. Cables and sensors attached to carved pillars covered in symbols that hurt my eyes to look at. But it was what floated above the altar that made my blood run cold. A sphere of absolute darkness hung in the air, its surface rippling like oil on water. As I watched, frozen in horror, shapes moved within it. Faces pressed against the surface from the inside, mouths open in silent screams. I recognized some of them, missing soldiers, previous inhabitants of my room, Private Thompson. The sphere pulsed, and with each beat, the faces changed. Some were human, others weren't. Through the overwhelming terror, I began to understand. This wasn't just a containment site. It was a doorway. The military hadn't just found something here, they'd been trying to use it. Movement behind me made me turn. Captain Moore stood there, but not the Captain Moore I knew. His skin seemed to ripple, features shifting like wax under heat. When he spoke, his voice echoed as if multiple people were talking at once. "You shouldn't be here, Private Nolan," the thing wearing Moore's face said. "But since you are, you might as well understand what you're seeing." He gestured at the sphere. Humanity always thinks it can control what it doesn't understand. In 1982, they found this chamber and thought they'd discovered a weapon, something they could use against their enemies. They never stopped to ask why it was buried so deep. The captain's form wavered, and for a moment, I saw something else standing there, something tall and dark and ancient. "We've been here longer than your species has walked upright," it said through Moore's mouth. This island, this place, it's not just a military base, it's a prison, and you've all been very helpful in breaking us out." The sphere pulsed again, stronger this time. The faces pressed harder against its surface, the barrier between our world and whatever lay beyond growing thinner. I could hear the whispers now, not just in my head, but in the air around me. They spoke of impossible things, of worlds beyond worlds, of hunger and darkness and freedom. Captain Moore, or whatever was using his form, stepped closer. "You have a choice now, Private Nolan. The same choice every soldier who's discovered this place has faced. You can join us willingly, become part of something greater than your limited human existence. Or," he smiled, his teeth too sharp, too numerous, "well, there really isn't an or, not anymore." The chamber began to shake. Deep in the darkness above, something moved. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and as I stood there watching the sphere pulse and grow, I realized with horror that this was just the beginning. The real nightmare was about to begin. The choice before me was no choice at all. As I stood there, watching the thing wearing Captain Moore's face, I remembered something Sergeant Harper had told me during my first week. Sometimes survival isn't about fighting, it's about knowing when to run. I ran. Behind me the chamber erupted into chaos. The sphere pulsed with blinding intensity, and the screams, no longer silent, echoed through the tunnel. Captain Moore's laughter followed me, distorting into something inhuman that reverberated through the metal and stone. I barely made it halfway up the tunnel before the first tremor hit. The walls shuddered, and that bioluminescent glow turned from pale blue to deep crimson. The air became thick with a black mist that moved against the wind, reaching for me with tendril-like formations. Corporal Reynolds appeared at the tunnel entrance, silhouetted against the emergency lights. "Jake, over here." She reached out her hand, but something was wrong. Her movements were too fluid, her voice too perfect. The Reynolds I knew had a slight stutter when she was stressed. "You're not her," I gasped, backing away. The thing wearing Reynolds' face smiled, and her skin began to ripple like the surface of the sphere. "Smart boy," it purred, her voice overlapping with others. "But it doesn't matter anymore. Look around you. Look what you've all helped us accomplish." The walls of the tunnel were changing. The smooth, glassy surface began to soften, becoming almost organic. Patterns emerged. Not the cryptic symbols from before, but images of what looked like memories. I saw flashes of the base's history playing out on the living walls. The first discovery in 1982, the failed attempts to control the entity, the gradual possession of the base's personnel. An explosion rocked the tunnel, and through the breach rushed Lieutenant Clark with a group of soldiers. Real ones this time. I could tell by the fear in their eyes. They carried strange equipment that looked like a cross between flamethrowers and energy weapons. "Private Nolan, get down," Clark shouted, raising her weapon. I dove to the floor as beams of intense blue light shot over my head, striking the thing that wore Reynolds' face. It screamed in 1,000 voices, its form dissolving into that same black mist. Clark grabbed my arm, pulling me up. "The containment field is failing," she said as we ran. "We have minutes, maybe less. Harper is preparing Protocol Zero, but we need to get to the surface first." "What is Protocol Zero?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "A last resort," she replied grimly. "In 1982, when they first found it, they also created a fail-safe. If the entity ever broke free, the entire base could be collapsed into the chamber, sealing it again." We emerged into the base proper, but I hardly recognized it. The walls pulsed with the same organic transformation I'd seen below. Black mist seeped from every vent, and the air was filled with whispers. Soldiers ran through the corridors, some fleeing, others moving with that too perfect grace that meant they weren't themselves anymore. Sergeant Harper met us at the emergency command center, his face streaked with blood from a gash on his forehead. "The entity is spreading faster than in 82, he reported, pulling up schematics on a flickering screen. "We've lost contact with the surface levels in the fog." He paused, swallowing hard. "The fog is changing everything it touches." Through the command center windows, I could see what he meant. The legendary Falkland's fog had transformed into something alive. It moved with purpose, wrapping around buildings and vehicles. Anything caught in it began to warp and change, metal and concrete becoming organic, pulsing with that same crimson light from below. The charges are set, Harper continued, but someone has to stay behind to trigger them manually. The remote detonator was damaged in the initial breach. Lieutenant Clark stepped forward. I'll do it. I was here in '82. I helped create this nightmare. It's fitting that I end it. Harper shook his head. The detonator is 5 levels down, near the main chamber. You'd never make it past the entity's strongest concentration. I can do it, I said, surprising myself. It's not looking for me. It thinks I'm trapped. Considering its offer, I can get close enough. Clark stared at me for a long moment, then handed me a small device. This is the detonator. Once you're in position, enter this code. She wrote a series of numbers on my palm. It'll give you 3 minutes to get clear, but she didn't need to finish. We all knew getting clear wasn't likely. Harper gave me his sidearm, though we knew it would be useless against what waited below. When this is over, he said quietly, someone needs to warn the outside. Make sure they never try to find this place again. The base shuddered around us, and through the window, we saw the sphere's dark energy beginning to rise from the lower levels, pushing through concrete and steel like they were paper. The entity was no longer content to stay hidden. It was rising, ready to spread beyond the base, beyond the island. I checked the detonator once more and turned toward the door. Behind me, Clark spoke one last time. Jake, in 1982, we thought we could control it, use it, but some things aren't meant to be controlled. Some things should stay buried. As I stepped into the corridor, the whispers returned, stronger than ever. They promised power, knowledge, transcendence. They showed me visions of what I could become if I joined them willingly, but beneath those promises, I heard the screams of everyone they'd already taken. The way back down to the chamber was a descent into madness. The base was transforming more with each passing minute. Walls breathed, floors rippled, and through it all, that black mist reached for me with growing desperation. I saw things in that mist. Faces, forms, fragments of realities that shouldn't exist. The entity knew I was coming. It had to, but maybe, just maybe, its own arrogance would be its undoing. After all, what could one human possibly do to stop something so ancient, so powerful? I was about to show them exactly what one human could do. The final descent felt like walking into the mouth of a living nightmare. The walls had fully transformed, pulsing with veins of that crimson light. The air was thick with the black mist, which now formed shapes that matched my worst fears. I saw my family, my friends, all reaching out with pleading expressions before dissolving back into darkness. 5 levels down, the main chamber had changed dramatically. The sphere had grown, now filling almost the entire space. The faces within pressed against its surface with increasing desperation, but they weren't trying to break free anymore. They were trying to warn me. Captain Moore stood at the chamber's center, but he'd abandoned any pretense of humanity. His form shifted constantly, revealing glimpses of something vast and impossible. Behind him, the ancient altar had merged with the military equipment, creating a grotesque hybrid of stone and steel that thrummed with power. We knew you'd return, Moore's voice echoed, overlapped with countless others. Humans are so predictable in their nobility. He gestured at the sphere. Look at what you're trying to destroy. Look at what you could be part of. The sphere pulsed and suddenly I could see beyond its surface. I saw worlds upon worlds, realities folded into each other like pages in an infinite book. I saw power that could reshape existence itself. For a moment, I understood why they'd tried to control it in 1982. The potential seemed limitless. But then I saw the cost. In those infinite worlds, I saw what the entity had done to countless other civilizations. It didn't share power, it consumed it. Every world it touched became part of its ever-growing nightmare. Every being it enlightened became another face in its collection. My hand tightened on the detonator in my pocket. I just needed to get closer to the altar. The charges Harper had set would collapse the entire chamber, but only if triggered from the right position. You still think like a human, Moore said, reading my intentions. Still believe in concepts like sacrifice and victory. His form solidified briefly into something that resembled a door-sized mirror, reflecting my own face back at me. But my reflection smiled with too many teeth, its eyes full of swirling darkness. The noble Private Nolan, my reflection spoke, stepping out of its mirror surface. So desperate to prove himself. To be a hero. It walked toward me with my own gait, wearing my own face. But let's be honest. You requested this posting because you were running away from your failures, your fears, your insignificant life. The chamber trembled. Above us, I heard the base's structure groaning as the transformation spread. We were running out of time. I had to keep it talking. Every step it took toward me was a step closer to where I needed to be. You're right, I said. I was running away, but I'm not running anymore. The thing wearing my face laughed. No, you're not. You're going to die here, alone, having accomplished nothing. The charges your friends planted are useless. We've already spread beyond this chamber, beyond this base. Even now, our influence spreads across the island. Maybe, I replied, taking another step toward the altar, but someone once told me that survival isn't about fighting. It's about knowing when to run. I locked eyes with my doppelganger, and when to stand your ground. I threw Harper's sidearm at the creature's face. It caught the gun reflexively, giving me the split second I needed. I sprinted toward the altar, drawing the detonator. The air itself seemed to fight against me, the black mist solidifying into tendrils that tried to hold me back. The thing wearing my face realized its mistake too late. I slammed into the altar and punched in the code Clark had written on my palm. The detonator hummed to life, its display showing 3 minutes and counting. You fool, Moore's voice boomed as his form dissolved completely into writhing darkness. You'll die with us. No, I said, watching the timer count down. I'll die instead of you. There's a difference. The chamber erupted into chaos. The sphere pulsed with blinding intensity, the faces within screaming in 1,000 voices. The walls began to crack, not from the charges but from the entity's rage. My doppelganger lunged for me, its form shifting between my face and something far more horrific. 2 minutes. The black mist consolidated into a solid wave of darkness, rushing toward me from all directions. I closed my eyes, thinking of Harper's words during my first day. Keep your head down, follow orders, and you'll do fine here. Sorry, Sergeant. Some orders are meant to be broken. 1 minute. The wave hit me like a physical force, trying to pour itself down my throat, into my eyes, seeking any way to possess me before the charges blew. I fought against it, focusing on who I was, what I was here to do. The faces in the sphere had changed. They were all watching me now, their expressions a mix of hope and terror. 30 seconds. The entity made one final attempt, flooding my mind with visions of power, of survival, of everything I could become if I just reached out and stopped the detonator. For a moment, I wavered. The possibilities were intoxicating. 10 seconds. A memory cut through the visions. Frank, the old maintenance worker, making that sign against evil. He'd survived the first incident in 1982. He'd lived with this knowledge, this burden, all these years. If he could stay strong, so could I. 5 seconds. Some things, I whispered, remembering Clark's words, should stay buried. The explosion started at the chamber's edge, the charges detonating in sequence. The entity screamed in rage and desperation as the ceiling began to collapse. The sphere pulsed erratically, its surface rippling with increasing violence. Through the chaos I saw the true face of what we'd awakened, something that had existed before time and would exist long after. But not here, not today. The last thing I saw was the sphere imploding, pulling everything toward it like a black hole. The transformed walls, the ancient altar, the writhing darkness of the entity itself. As the chamber collapsed around me, I felt a moment of perfect clarity. This was why I'd been drawn to this place, to this posting. Not to run away, but to be here at this exact moment. The darkness took me, but not the entity's darkness. This was the simple darkness of an ending, of rest, of a job well done. In the years that followed, the Falkland Islands incident was officially listed as a training accident. The base was decommissioned, the area declared a restricted zone, maps were redrawn, records were sealed, and the world moved on. But if you find yourself on those islands, if you see the fog rolling in thicker than natural, if you hear whispers in the static of your radio, run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because while we sealed that ancient evil back in its prison, prisons can be broken, and some things never stop trying to break free. I know this because sometimes, in my dreams, I can still hear them whispering, still see those faces pressed against the sphere's surface, still feel the weight of the detonator in my hand, and I wonder, did we really win that day, or did we just postpone the inevitable? The Falkland Islands hold many secrets. Some are written in military reports, others in the faces of the survivors. But the darkest secret of all lies buried beneath the ruins of Mount Pleasant Base, waiting, always waiting. And the fog keeps rolling in.